Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
Suffering and the Paranormal. A lecture given by Canon Martin Shaw at the Bournemouth Southern Region West Conference of the CFPSS held in April 1990. The theme of the conference, To Faith and Knowledge. Suffering and the Paranormal. Canon Martin Shaw.
Does not mean that after I've finished talking, if you do have any questions relating to what I'm about to say, then of course please do put them. It's just as a result of not only what I've been saying, but indeed all the two talks raise a whole number of issues, and so I do hope you record these issues and use that tomorrow. I am perhaps, and I mean this quite seriously, one of the youngest here. I was born on the 22nd of September 1944, which I think, if I'm right in saying, is 3.5 months after the Normandy landings. I think they took place in June 1944. The reason why I say that is that although I'm, as it were, the offspring of one of the battles of the Bulge, so to speak. Please do not misunderstand me. Nevertheless, I have not myself seen battle, and therefore, in the light of some of the faces I've been looking at, let alone some of the voices I've been listening to, I am feeling, as the weekend progresses, less and less qualified to talk about suffering and the paranormal. On the other hand, one of the troubles about being deeply involved in suffering is that one very easily, not necessarily, but very easily loses an objective, or not so much an objective view, because I don't like that word objective, but a detached view about what suffering actually is. Now, I don't have that either, because there are various bits and pieces in my own life, which you'll be hearing shortly, which have given me an opportunity to understand at least suffering at an individual level. But I want to begin by talking, first of all, about suffering in terms of affliction, a general sense of what suffering actually might be. Let me illustrate this with one of my favorite stories, which comes from the early 1930s in Massachusetts in the United States. And if there are any doctors or very proficient nurses, it sounds as if I'm saying that doctors are always proficient there, aren't I? Sorry. If there are any doctors or nurses present, please would you close your ears at this point in case I've got the medical facts wrong. It's the gist of the story that really matters. This story takes place in the days before blood transfusion through bottles and refrigeration, when blood transfusions, I believed, happened directly, through garden hoses and things like that. Anyway, a family in Massachusetts consisted of a husband and wife and 2 children, one of 9-year-old and one of 7-year-old. Now, the son was 9 and the daughter was 7. Now, I think I've got my facts right. In this country now, you're not allowed to give blood if you are under 7 stone, and I believe you've got to be over 16. Am I right in saying that? It may be even more than that. But certainly, I don't think you'd be allowed to give blood to the blood transfusion centre parked in the middle of your village square, if you're 9 years old. Now, what happened in this particular story, that it was discovered that Jonathan's sister, what a dreadful thing this is, Jonathan's sister was suffering from a dreadful cancer of the blood, which we now, of course, call, I believe, leukemia, which some of you may have first-hand knowledge of. Now, the trouble is that the sister had an extremely rare blood type. And the mother and father had also been very ill and had contamination of the blood, which left only one source, my goodness, one source for blood. And the doctor said to the mother, now look, this is an extremely rare blood type, and time is really not on our side. And just a tiny little bit of Jonathan's blood might help to reverse the awful process that has begun in your daughter's life. So would you please bring Jonathan into work so we can discuss this? And this is where, of course, the doctor was not careful. So he sat Jonathan down on the chairs, and I listened very, very carefully. And Jonathan listened very, very carefully. He said, now, I need your help. Certainly, said Jonathan. Well, now, look, you know your sister is very seriously ill. Yes. I would like, this is where he wasn't careful, I would like you to give your blood for your sister. Jonathan must have been Scottish. Thought to himself, I will need time to think about this. Why? Well, it's a very serious question, I mean, presumably you want me to treat it very seriously. So he said, certainly. So he walked out in the corridor and paced up and down. Mother, come here. So his mother, look, what do you think? Well, I think he's treating you in an adult fashion. You must make your own mind up. Now, you know the circumstances. Oh, yes, indeed, said Jonathan. Well, all right then. And so he went in, and the doctor said, now, please, would you be very careful, relax between town and tomorrow, and you come in round about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, have a reasonable breakfast, not too much for lunch, just very, very light, come in, and we will get on with this particular job. Next day, Jonathan came in, lay down on the bed, gritting his teeth like this, and the garden hose was plugged in, you see. And his doctor said, you know, all doctors say this, don't they? Infuriating. Relax. You know, relax. It won't take long. I know it won't take long. It's not that I'm worried about. What are you worried about? Well, just get on with it, will you? And so a few minutes later, the doctor came in and said, that's fine, Jonathan. You can relax now. Still clenching his teeth. What are you still clenching your teeth for? Because I'm not dead yet. The assumption being, of course, from the doctor's question, that he was to give all his blood for his sister, not just a little of it. Now, all of us, in many ways, could tell stories not like that, of Jonathan's, yes, beautiful naivety. Goodness me, only if we could have a little bit more naivety, particularly in the Church of England. Desperately serious, getting things right, with the result is we always get them wrong. And, only we could have a few more Jonathans around who lived like that. But the thing is, it is easy, in one sense, to talk about suffering in that way. There was a psychic, you might say, a paranormal relationship between Jonathan and his sister, which was a kind of brother-sister relationship, and he automatically made the assumption, well, there's only one thing to do, it's my sister. End of story. I must give my life for my sister. There's no discussion, so let's get on with it. Now, that aspect of suffering, tragic though it actually is, because the daughter eventually did die, is relatively easy to talk about. What is much more difficult to talk about is when we look at suffering in terms of groups and in terms of race memory. And that's what slightly worries me about the church. We talk about suffering and we're inclined to get locked into looking at suffering on an individual basis, very serious though that is. I want to particularly share the whole business of what happens when there is affliction, which I think is a much better word than suffering, affliction in a large scale. Let me illustrate this from the diary of a Dutch Jew called Wiesel, who was one of the very few to survive the Treblinka concentration camp, death camp. Now, in this diary, he describes the most appalling scene, which you will recognize, of course, when I get to the end of it. And the scene starts like this. There is a platform, rather like the one I was describing yesterday, and the platform had 3 ropes hanging, 3 gallows. And to be hanged were 3 Jews. One of them was a boy of 11 years old who had the nickname in Treblinka camp as the Little Angel. And all the SS soldiers brought the 3 people out, and he told the whole camp, "Stand and raise your heads," said one SS soldier, "and look." And of course, there was mutterings, bow your head in reverence. And the 3 people were asked to stand on chairs, including the boy, and they had their heads put through the nooses. Now, the head SS soldier put a noose through the 2 adults, fine. When it got to the boy, he had a little humanity in him, and he found it very difficult to do. So another SSS officer stood forward for him and put the noose over the little angel's head. And all the camp stood and watched. And one by one, the chairs were kicked away from underneath the men. The sight was appalling. There was a shout, "Watch the dying," came from the SS soldier. And they raised their heads, and they could see that the 2 men were dead. Their tongues were extended, they were blue-tinged, and they were swollen, according to this diary. But the little boy was still alive, because he, of course, was much, much lighter. He took longer to die. And the SS soldiers told them, all the camp, to walk in front and look straight into the faces, to warn them of fidelity to the SS commandant. And as they were passing, Wiesel's neighbors said to him, "Where is God now? Where is he? Where is God now?" And a voice next and said, "He is right in front of you." And as Wiesel lifted his eyes, he looked into the boy's face, now dead, and there he was, a Jew, and he suddenly realized what it was to describe God crucified. Not that I am suggesting that Wiesel is now a Christian. How do we contend with suffering on such a scale? And what are indeed the psychic, paranormal, whatever word you want to use, offscourings of such an event? Because Wiesel, at the end of his diary, said, "That evening, as we went to drink our soup, obviously it tasted sour." And if a psychic event of such an evil event made the soup turn sour, what is the effect on the earth, on the chair, on the rope, on the people around that event? And as you know, many people have dedicated the whole of their lives to intercede, not just for those who were killed in the concentration camps, but indeed for the men and women who in fact participated in that event. Now, for me, there has only been, in my very short experience at the age of 45, one writer and one 20th century saint who has remotely helped me to address this question about suffering and affliction on such a scale. And she is also a Jewess, and as far as I know, she died a Jewess, and some people believe, and indeed the coroner believed, that she committed suicide. Her name was Simone Weil. And Simone Weil died at the age of 34, and her commoner's grave you will find in Ashford on this particular day. I don't know whether you saw a Channel 4 program on Simone Weil on Good Friday evening. And she wrote an essay on one of the phrases in the Creed, "He descended into hell." Now, I would contend, as a result of reading, and indeed, may I say, living and praying in my short life with Simone Weil in her books, it seems to me that she has made that sentence, "He descended into hell," one of the most joyous and one of the most gorgeous and beautiful statements that I have ever come across. He descended into hell. Because of that, there is hope. Because of that, there is encouragement in all circumstances, including standing in front of an execution. Because Simone Weil, above all people, however you pronounce her name, understood what it is when God actually distances himself from himself. There is no place in the universe, she contends, that God has not already been, not even the bottom of a black hole, which is the most distant place you can possibly go to. God has traversed the whole of the universe so that all things, yes, even evil itself, maybe that makes me guilty of heresy, even evil itself is caught up into God's love. So, is there anything at all outside the scope of God's love? Well, Dr. Martin Israel, I think in a talk that I heard from this conference, which is on tape, a talk which was called The Spirit of Counsel, I presume, I have not read it, which you will find in one of the books published over there, described for him, and presumably he still does, described for him who Christ actually is. And Christ is wherever there are two things. First of all, unconditional love, and that's total. Unconditional love, no conditions whatsoever on who or what you love. And secondly, self-renunciation. Wherever you find these two things, then Christ in his totality, and indeed we're talking about a mystery here, oh my goodness me, a mystery. Wherever these two things are present, there Christ is present. Whether you be a Buddhist, a Jain, Sikh, Parsi, Methodist, URC, whatever you happen to be. Now we might argue about that, but of course the point being, as Dr. Israel says, that there has only been one person that has actually managed to manifest unconditional love and self-renunciation in its totality, and that of course is Jesus Christ. So what does that make when we actually look at somebody like Hitler? Or, dare I say, we look at terrorism, or dare I say Ethiopia, which is a form of terrorism. Yes, indeed, it's a form of terrorism. Because they're starving because you and I are fat. It's a fact. Whether we like it or not, we participate in the starvation of these people there. So am I really any different from Adolf Hitler? Because in the end, it's by my being a guilty bystander that I participate in all these monstrosities. Now that either makes me totally disabled from actually doing anything about it, or it means that I must get right into the heart of wherever hell happens to be, because that's where Christ descended. Hooray, hallelujah. Because only if you understand that can you begin, even remotely begin, to understand what the resurrection means. In some ways, and dare I be provocative, I suppose 95% of the time, yes, I may lose a lot of friends, I actually think I am a pre-resurrection Christian. Because I actually find it's so appallingly difficult to understand with my mind and get my hands round it. And very occasionally can I just catch a glimpse, what Wordsworth called an intimation of immortality around the person of Christ. And so when I have experiences of those and hear people talk about communications beyond the grave, all I can do is to say, please take me by the hand. I know these to be true from your own lives and your own eyes and your own faces. But it is so appallingly easy to talk about these, because the real fact, as far as I'm concerned, is that unless I understand the nature of hell into which Christ has descended, I really cannot come to grips with his resurrection, let alone communications beyond the grave. Let alone that. It's extremely important, this. Because first and foremost, we are people of the wounded healer, the wounded and risen Lord. Woundedness is absolutely a prerequisite before you can actually start talking about resurrection. And I, for one, have seen very, very, very little suffering in my own life. Very little. Most of it's been indirect. And therefore, I sometimes think, I have honestly to say, dear Lord, in the company of all those good people who have got much deeper psychic sense than I have to say that perhaps one day I will begin to understand and long for these things, but at present, Lord, I am still with you as you descend into hell. So lift me out from hell with you. Let me just read a wonderful poem by a fellow Scot, Edwin Muir, and it's called The Good Man in Hell. Now, for those of you who are very orthodox Christians, and I presume there are a few of you among here, this perhaps will put me in a heresy which is called universalism. And you'll see why. If a good man were ever housed in hell, by needful error of the qualities, perhaps to prove the rule or shame the devil, or speak the truth only a stranger sees, would he, surrendering to obvious hate, fill half eternity with cries and tears, or watch beside hell's little wicket gate in patience for the first 10,000 years, feeling the curse climb slowly to his throat, that utter dooms him to rescindless ill, forcing his praying tongue to run by rote, eternity entire before him still? Oh, would he at last, grown faithful in hell, what a wonderful idea, grown faithful in his station, kindle a little hope in hopeless hell, and so among the damned doubts of damnation, since here someone could live and could live well, one doubt of evil would bring down such a grace, open such a gate, all Eden would enter in. Hell be a place like any other place, and love and hate and life and death begin. And it seems to me that unless you believe that, what actually happens is we are consigning one half of humanity to total lostness beyond the reach of God, and the other half, simply because of faith and knowledge, into God's kingdom. And that seems to me is certainly not a God I would want to believe in, because that is making him, in my view, into a much worse tyrant than Hitler himself. Wonder what your views of that are. In 1976, when I was a chaplain in Cambridge University, I was on a retreat in Wales. And I received a phone call from my wife to tell me that our baby son had died. It was a cot death. Some of you may know of this condition. To say that, of course, is slightly contradictory because we don't really know what cot death actually is. And what is so infuriating, I was absolutely furious with this, is why on earth does it apparently happen that somebody just dies? God damn it, why does somebody die? What do you think you're doing, God? I'm a Church of England clergyman. Good heavens, what do you think you're doing? I've done all the right things. I went to university. Now this child dies. What have I done to deserve this? What I didn't notice, and you see, here is where the suffering begins to tell, and it's associated with forgiveness. What I didn't notice, and if you could please forgive me if I give you the physical details, it's very important and rather painful this, is that when a woman lactates and suddenly a baby dies, the female does not suddenly stop lactating. And that can become extremely painful and uncomfortable. And then along comes a doctor, and I think he gives you something like estrogen or something like that, some hormone pill to stop you, and that's very, very uncomfortable. And there was my wife trying to contend with the death of this baby, and a sort of raging, pathetic husband going on about, oh, me, all this nonsense. Until somebody said to me, for God's sake, Martha, would you please look at your wife? And I suddenly realized that the real suffering was not, in fact, the death of the baby, but the real suffering was to do with our own sense of understanding the planet which we're actually in. And there was somebody who actually slapped me across the face, like Mrs. Noah does to Noah, and said, now look, would you please look at your wife? And it was when I looked at her, I understood for the first time what the beauty of suffering is really about. Because we hugged each other, and the person that slapped, we joined in and had a Trinitarian hug. You see? Vitally important. That a wonderful experience, because I remember hearing Mother Frances Dominica, who, of course, as you know, is the founder of Helen House, the hospice for terminally ill children, describe the dying of small children in terms of what she describes as severe beauty. Severe beauty. Now, it seems to me it's only the Christian mystery that actually begins to get its hands round that. That which, on the one hand, is severe, but is also beautiful in the midst of the affliction, not just of the child dying, but the parents coming to terms with it, the hospice, the community coming to terms with what's actually happening. We're not just talking about individual suffering, we're talking about what actually happens to a community. A few months later, after one began to recover from this, I had a dream. And in this dream, a door opened, and there was a black woman, wonderfully round and huge, with bare breasts. And she was weeping her eyes out, and in her arms was a dead baby. The following morning, I got up and did my usual rounds, and the telephone went. And I was asked to go round by a local cot death support group to visit this particular house. And when I got to the door, it was the door I saw in my dream. And I opened it, and Exeter, I think you will vouch for this, is not absolutely swarming with West Indians. You know, I mean, they don't actually great quantity. And when I opened it, there was this woman, black, with a dead baby in her arms. And I have absolutely no way of getting, there's no way I can understand what this happened. But I just realized at that moment that what I was asked to do was to go in there and hug this woman and cry with her and shout and bawl and scream and kick pillows and allow her to be angry and the husband to be angry. Because it seems to me that that's also a way of prayer and a way of actually looking seriously at the depths of that particular kind of affliction. Now, I am not saying that, well, I'm God, and what I'll do is I'll kill Martin Shaw's baby so that he can pray for people who've caught death. That's been monstrous. All I'm saying is that I was deeply involved in a mystery that I will not understand this side of the grave, except what I've got to do is get on with it and be responsive to the call of God, which was opened, that consciousness opened up as a result of my own particular experience. In North Uist, in the Outer Isles, some of you who come from Scotland will know what I mean when you describe a part of a land being thin. There's a kind of, the earth crust has a kind of thin quality about it. And it is often said by those who are involved in the ancient history of architecture that some of the ancient cathedrals and chapels, particularly in the Celtic Church, were built on these very important, what we call ley lines, because there's a very important power point there. Now, whether that's true or not, when I was out in North Uist, and my wife and I were having a holiday, absolutely clear sky, very flat landscape, beautiful bird watching country, by the way, and suddenly a cloud formed over the top of our heads. Now, my wife is you'll be glad to know, in the result of hearing me, an extremely sensible lady, you see. So I said to her, do you see what I see? Yes. She said, oh, this is cloud, it's suddenly growing. It's right over the top of us. It wasn't a mist, it was a cloud. So we stood up and we carried on our walk thinking, relief rain? Absolutely clear day. What's more, it was a breeze, it was still there, and it went with us. We got to a fence and we saw an extremely unusual sight, about 100 buzzards. Now, as you know, buzzards normally go in pairs, not in hundreds. And they were all there on that fence. We stopped. Are you surprised? And when we looked, we saw next to the buzzards a hut, a bird watcher's hut. And we went into the bird watcher's hut, and there was a book open, and very clear writing until it got to describing buzzards. And then the writing became spidery, and finished halfway through a sentence, and the pen was left there, and we had to make the assumption that the bird watcher left out of fear. So we began to pick up one or two signals. So my wife very sensibly said, I think we ought to go. When we got to the fence of this nature reserve, the buzzards were over the top of our heads. When we closed the gates, the buzzards went back to where they were. Now, I did some research when I got back home, a safe distance, and I discovered that there was a huge massacre in this island, of course, during the great clan warfare in the 16th and 17th century on the Outer Isles. Now, here, once again, one is dealing with the whole business of what actually happens when there is massive death and destruction around. What happens to that particular energy? Had it been short-circuited? Had it been prayed about? And all I can tell you as a result of doing that exercise and handing that information over to a person I know and love and dearly respect, these particular symptoms that had been around had disappeared. Now, the whereabouts of the bird watcher, I do not know. I do not know. All I can tell you is that the hotel where he was staying, he returned there, picked up his bags and got on the first ferry and left the island. Now, that may be a very interesting story, But similar things actually happen to this very day on the island of Guyana. I don't know whether you remember, 10 years ago, excuse me, oh dear, I'm yattering on here. 10 years ago, a man called Jim Jones, an American, managed to persuade 900 people to join him on the island of Guyana. Do you remember? And he persuaded 900 people to commit suicide. And I remember saying to my wife, simple people. Who are these? They must have been poor people from Los Angeles, or sort of making really sort of pathetic British remarks, like we all make, sort of telegraph readers. Oh, whoops, sorry. Sorry. You see me afterwards. Anyway, it's a monstrous remark. And when I read a book by a man called Shiva Naipaul, which is a must, I think, for the Fellowship of Psychic and Spiritual Studies. It's called Black and White, Shiva Naipaul, which is a study of events just like this. Of course, I discovered that the 900 people were good, true, twin-set, purple rins, clergymen, Anglicans, people like you and I, who had been persuaded by this man to go and join him in a New Age group on this. And I'm not, please don't mistake that when a group of people come together, it is very, very easy to manipulate them. And to this very day, nothing, absolutely nothing, grows on the spot where these 900 people were removed. And they were removed within days. We're not talking about a sort of land becoming fetid. And a whole lot of people have actually tried to gather round to pray for the souls of those who died at that particular time. And it's a lot of extremely hard work. And so it seems to me the whole business of group suffering as well as individual is an extremely important one for us to get involved in. Now, you'll be glad to know that I feel that there is a very important piece of work needs to be done when groups get together. And I feel I ought to say a little bit more, which I was talking about last night. When we are talking about suffering and groups of people who come together to pray. But first of all, there are individuals whom I believe who are deeply gifted in this particular area. And the thing, in my own view, is that most of them are hidden and you and I will never get to know them. There is an Anglican religious community, and it's not the only one by any means, let alone in other denominations, who dedicate themselves to praying in the middle of the night. They're called the Society of the Love of God at Fairacres in Oxford. And they're contemplative sisters. They're not the only Anglicans who do this, I hasten to add. But they rise in the middle of the night in order to pray specifically for those who die, either in groups or under great oppression. And that kind of work is absolutely essential, because very often it is in the night when people are at their lowest that kind of prayer is utterly essential. Or let's take Dr. Cutting, who goes back regularly to the camps in Beirut. She is not only a doctor, but people often say of her that when she is actually present, all the negative energies of the internecine fighting in Beirut seem to somehow or other short-circuit themselves through her, even for a short period of time. Wonder what would happen, this shows you what a complete nutcase I am, if we all decided to catch the next plane out to Beirut and in silence actually just sat there in the middle of Beirut, and just in silence, and allowed ourselves to become a vehicle to descend into the hell of that place, to allow ourselves to take our baptism seriously. He descended into hell, and to join Christ there. Because if it can happen through one woman like Dr. Cutting, wonder what would happen if we actually managed to increase the number of people present there. Just a little question. So groups. I think there are 6 essential stages that a group needs to look at in order to intercede for those who are suffering, particularly groups of people who are suffering. Let me very briefly go through them. Number 1, when a group comes together, it is essential to do what Margaret Salmon did with us this morning, and that is let the group know how long you are going to be together, so that you decrease the amount of fear and anxiety about the time you're going to be together. Get the practical things right and finish when you say you're going to finish. Otherwise, it's going to be open to all kinds of things that might actually happen at the edge. Next, make sure that the group concentrates on the presence of Christ in that very moment. And that can either happen by a biblical reading, by a meditation such as the one that Margaret gave us this morning. It might actually happen by using the symbol of being surrounded by the light of Christ, by his hands, by his crucifixion, by his resurrection. Always begin by bringing Christ into the... Of course he's there, but you can in fact keep him out. So it's very important to welcome him into the midst of the group. And you can use things like a crucifix, a candle, an icon, anything that helps you to focus on Christ's unconditional love and his self-renunciation to which each one of us is called. That's stage one. The second stage is to confess the corporate sin of the group. Now, corporate sin might either be a combination of the sinfulness of each one of us present there, our pride, our lies, our deceit, whatever it may be. Now, it may very well be that a group gets to know each other so well that it might even be possible for the individuals to begin to share where they felt in the last week that they have actually committed sin. And that can actually happen. It's very important, this next stage, to confess. And if not, then a general confession of sin. Then the third stage is to ask the person or the group or even the nation to be present in front of you, whatever form that comes to you. Either it might be a map in your imagination or literally to help. It might simply be somebody's name. But here is the most important thing of all, and I would like some comeback on this because it's actually quite difficult at times to manage this. Does the person or group for whom you are praying know that you are doing that? That, it seems to me, is essential. If it's directly impossible to do that, does a friend of the person or a friend of the group know? Because otherwise, you might actually be entering into an area that you, in fact, are not meant to enter. So it's at the very least, make sure that you have done everything possible to actually discover that the person has given you permission. Obviously, if it's a nation, that's of a very different level. You don't need to go and ask President Bush, dear President Bush, we would please like to ask your permission to pray for you, the sort of Julian group in Chipping Sodbury, yours sincerely, because I don't think he's got too much time to answer your letter. What I'm actually talking about is the focused prayer on a small group or an individual. The fourth point is, when that person or group is in front of you, allow as many ways as is possible, depending on the nature of the group and how people's imagination works, to use the hands. I don't mean literally, it might be. I mean, I find it very helpful to use my hands, as you've discovered. I find it very, even if somebody's not there, to put my hands out, even though I do it, Helen or George, use hands. If you're not a hand person, it might be a word. Christ the healer, the light of Christ, the crucified one, the resurrection of Christ, joy, whatever word that is really important to you if you're a word person. Or it might even be the heat and the warmth of Christ. That wonderful story in the New Testament about the beloved disciple laying his head against Christ. What you might do is take the person and lean the person's head imaginatively against the breast of Christ. And then what that happens is extremely important. The fifth stage is then to ask that person or the group to leave. Actually ask them, direct them to leave. Thank you very much. Would you please now leave? Because it can very often happen that when you bring somebody else in, you might be bringing all kinds of other energies into group. It's very important is that you ask the person to leave so that you can have that loving detachment, that extraordinary paradoxical loving detachment with a person or group for whom you're praying. And finally, make sure that you give thanks for what has happened, because all prayer is always answered. Maybe not in the way you or the group want it to be answered, but it is always answered. So it is extremely important to give thanks at the end of the prayer, because this is a confirmation of what we actually believe to be true, that Christ actually descends into every corner of hell itself, including the person or the group for whom you are praying. And so I finish with another quote from Edwin Muir, because one of my favorite, yes, and I don't just saying this to be dramatic, one of my favorite persons in the New Testament is Judas Iscariot. Yes, favorite. Because all the dilemmas I face in my own life are largely to do with deception, to do with my own hunger for power, including spiritually, terrible disease of the clergy, wanting to be in control. I am a great spiritual guru, you're in need of me, aren't you? All that kind of appalling nonsense, the kind of stuff that Judas was into, that eventually he had to betray Christ because he was so seduced by power. And I love this little section. But Christ will come again, it said, though not unwanted and unsummoned, for all things, beasts of the field, and woods, and rocks, and seas, and all mankind from end to end of the earth. Thank you, Geoffrey, for this morning. All mankind from end to end of the earth will call him with one voice. In our own time, some say, or at a time when time is ripe. Then he will come, Christ the uncrucified, Christ the discrucified, his death undone, his agony unmade, his cross dismantled, glad to be so, and the tormented wood will cure its hurt and grow into a tree in a springing green corner of young Eden. And Judas, damned, take his long journey backward from darkness into light, and be a child beside his mother's knee, and the betrayal be quite undone, and never more be done. Thank you.
Well, again, Martin has given us a lot to think about. I feel I must thank him on your behalf for his total honesty in his sharing with us, speaking as a Daily Telegraph reader, amongst those who might not always agree with you, but total honesty in very serious areas as well, sharing his difficulties in his relationship with us and some of the things we believe, and where he is now in his life, as opposed to where he deduces most of us may be, although no doubt some of us could provide surprises for him too in that respect. We have time for questions, so if you'd like a moment or two, and then if anyone would like to come back to him to ask questions about any of the points he's raised, we can do it now as well as the question panel tomorrow.
I don't know where this passage is, and perhaps you can tell me or somebody can. Though it doesn't Christ say to one of his disciples somewhere, have I to be crucified again? There's something where, the question of Christ having been crucified, perhaps after his resurrection, comes back. And it may be to do with one of the other disciples who perhaps is still resisting what he should be doing, or Christ, what he should be doing. And Christ says, do I need to be crucified again?
The question was, is there a place in the New Testament where Christ says to his disciples, must I be crucified again? Well, I must get this out of my mind. I certainly am not too sure about that. What a dreadful man. Is it?
I think it's a passage in Quo Vadis.
I was going to say in the brothers Karamazov, there is the wonderful novel by Dostoevsky. The brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, there is the great chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, where Jesus comes before the judge, and the judge says, "Name." Sorry, I must get this right. You, young man, are guilty of changing the faith. You are guilty of ignoring all our laws. Is this true? Yes. And he goes on with questions like this, and he says, "What is your name?" And he says, "My name is Jesus Christ." "Well, I'm very sorry. I couldn't care less what your name is. You'll have to be crucified all over again because we are not ready for you." I just wonder if that's what you're referring to.
And for some reason, Jesus says, must I be crucified again?
Ah.
I'm certain it's Quo Vadis, actually.
That's right.
I've not read it for many
Yes, and then Peter turns round and goes back into... Peter turns round and goes back, and he's crucified upside down. Thank you for that. Yes. What's the name of that what was the name of the writer of Quo Vadis?
Sienkiewicz.
Yes. Wonderful. "Where are you going, Peter?" And he says, "I'm fleeing, Lord." He said, "Well," Peter says to him, "Where are you going, Lord?" And the Lord says, "I'm going to be crucified for you all over again." And it's at that point Peter returns. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, sir.
Did I understand in one point in your very interesting speech for you to say that your God could not allow eternal damnation to you?
I think I'm very tempted, like good Anglican clergy, to sort of fudge this one, but I think I have to say yes. If I'm going to be guilty of heresy, I'd far rather be guilty of that heresy than any other, because it seems to me that if we are saying that there are individuals who will for eternity literally forever be lost, what are we saying about the omnipotence of God's love? I think I'm right in saying that Eric Doyle, that great man, addressed himself to this particular issue, in which he says total evil, and I think he said this, and he, a splendid Roman Catholic dogmatician of all, I mean, knows much more about that than I do. He tries to say that evil is that which brings to nothing, literally brings to nothing, and therefore that is beyond the reach of love. Now, if somebody like Hitler or whoever is damned in hell, that's not nothing. That's not nothing, it's a lot. It may take him a long time, and I'm using poetic language here, to, like Judas, to work his way backwards, and maybe we can actually pray for Adolf Hitler and for all his works, and bring him. So yes, I think in the end of the day, certainly according to Hebrews chapter 9, I would be guilty of the heresy of universalism, because in the end, I do not believe that a God of love leaves any one person out of his particular economy. Yes.
I have difficulty with that.
Surprise.
God doesn't put them into hell. They themselves go into a hell of their own making. Because if they went into heaven, they would be like fish out of water. It would be a terrible suffering for them if it happened. I believe that there's the chance of progress. The opportunity is there. But they must go into the level that their own life has fashioned, as it were, this side of death.
Yes.
But God doesn't force them into it. They themselves naturally gravitate to that particular level.
Is there a chance of progress then? Beyond this life?
That's the love of God.
I'll get on to that one.
Sorry, would you just like to repeat your question again?
Is there a chance of progress beyond this life? In other words, eternal damnation is something of free choice in the next life, in as much that one could work out your way out of that. In other words, it's not eternal damnation. I don't understand. It is a confusion.
Well, I think I certainly, for one, would say yes to that, and I would say yes. What a wonderful confusion you are in, because when we're actually talking about the economy of God, and I take your point entirely, Angus. I don't think it's a love that God forces. I think he's probably crying his eyes out, but he will continue to cry his eyes out, and will constantly allow his tears to drop into all of hell until the last person is rescued of their particular choice. But when we use choice and about beyond death, we're using a language trying to grasp at mystery again, and we don't have that language. And all you can do is stutter. a wonderful a friend of mine called Richard Holloway, who's the Bishop of Edinburgh, and a great privilege to be his curate for 5 years. Wonderful, wonderful preacher. In a wonderful book of his called A New Vision of Glory, has a chapter called The Autistic Universe. Wonderful description that, you know what autism is, where you live, the child, or indeed the young adult, apparently looks well, but lives in a world totally of its own. There is no way of communicating. I believe it's the most appalling circumstances for a mother and father to have to. Some of you may know this. Now, in many ways, I think that's what it's like for us in this particular life. We're like autistic children. We've got a loving God and Father constantly around, and that autism will slowly break down beyond death. And that's why it seems to me very important to continually, through Christ, to pray for the dying, so that breaking down of the tunnel vision and the autism begins to break down until that last moment we go, ah. And the only language of heaven, it seems to me, is, ah.
So much of conventional Christian teaching is, if we don't get it right in this life, we are condemned to eternal damnation.
Indeed. But may I add, in case I sadden my dear fellow brother there, it seems to me that we're in danger, and I am in danger of watering down the experience of hell and of damnation. Because after all, Judas, and maybe me along with him, because of all my dilemmas, will have to, all the relationships that I have got into, some of them pretty seedy ones, like everybody in this room, will have to be undone somehow or other. Through Christ, of course. He will have to heal it by our cooperation, or lack of it, and with a bit of help. And if I die in the next few minutes, do pray for me, please. Now, so it's damnation. The way the word has been used, I think it's, if you like, the hard work we've got to do. There's a lot of hard work to be done. And I rather prefer that idea than the idea of damnation, which has got a kind of...
But eternal damnation.
Indeed. Barbara, help me.
No, I'm not going to help you. I'm going to ask you another question.
Oh, God.
Well, perhaps Angus may be able to help on this one. I understand that there are different translations of eternal. In the teaching of eternal damnation, there's actually aeonian damnation, an aeon, which is an age, a set period, rather than eternal going on forever. I don't know whether there are any biblical scholars here who can come in on that one.
Could I offer a thought here? Because, you see, some of the people with whom we had conversations...
Can you hear?
May I suggest, Geoffrey, you use the microphone?
We had conversations...
Geoffrey, can I interrupt you? Could you angle...
With whom we had conversations were, in fact, in this particular state that we're talking about. That is to say, they had finished their lives in such desperate hate of themselves and all their circumstances that they were in a kind of death. They were in a kind of aeonic death, in the sense that they had lost any sense of time. They were not aware of the passage of time, but just of their continuing self-hate. And these were the types of people who were the most difficult to reach, so that indeed all those blessed people on the other side who are trying to rescue people from such a state, if that is how they come over, very often could not even make themselves observed to them. And there was great difficulty in finding a way of breaking through that hard callus of self-centeredness, which was often a self-hate. And this is really perhaps what is meant by Jesus when he says that by the judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. Because these were people who were self-righteous. They had always been offensive about other people, offensive about themselves. And when things went wrong for them, so that they lost all self-respect and everything else as well, then they turned that hate on themselves. And they were being judged by themselves and wouldn't come out of this. And quite often, because this is the question that arises, quite often the only hope that they had in the short term at any rate, and by the short term I'm probably meaning about 50 years or more, the most extended one being in a very evil way for something like 150 years, who came out, not because of us, but we heard and they talked to us about it. Very often the contact had to be the evidence through prayer of someone who they very often damaged or hurt or deeply wronged, nevertheless having enough love for them still to pray for them. And this is why this sort of thing happens, these rescue circles, because such people are more open to prayer from earth people, with whom they still are in some sense in similarity, than they are from the higher beings who are trying to help them. I'll just put that in passing anyway, that's an explanation.
The only thing I would add, in the company of people who have done much more research for this, but I think one of the most important things to remember is why this work is taking place at all. And I think it's essential to hold on to the fact that if love, which is extremely hard work, is our major task, then why it is important to pray for the dying is to actually help them to participate with us in the service of the universe and of the planet Earth. That's why it's happening. It's in order to make sure that people are actually serving planet Earth towards the consummation that God is drawing all things. And that's why we're doing, and not just simply so that individuals move on towards God, which can in fact be a rather selfish motivation. The reason why I want you to pray for me when I'm dead is so that I can continue to be a servant of God and be a better one on planet Earth. Maybe. That may be one approach to understanding the whole business of reincarnation. Sir?
Yes. In the light of what has been discussed to date, I was wondering if someone in this room could help me with a small problem that I have regarding my membership of this fellowship. And it's with two pieces of scripture. Matthew 25, where Jesus separates the sheep from the goats, and the description of the second death in Revelation. I'd appreciate some guidance, because these are two pieces of scripture that I find difficulty with regard to what I hear here and what I'm trying to make of God's word.
Yes, well, I am going to hand over to somebody else who may have a much more in-depth view, but I think it...
May I tell you just the answer to that one?
Please do.
I think there's a book by William Barclay called A Plain Man Looks at the Apostles' Creed.
Can everybody hear all right?
And he describes this parable of the sheep and the goats and the translation of it. And he said that the goats who are condemned to everlasting punishment, the word, as Mrs. Errol said, is in, which means, can mean as long as it takes. It's rather as long as a piece of string. And the word punishment is the gardening term, pruning. There's William Barclay's book, A Plain Man Looks at the Apostles' Creed.
How do you feel about that, sir?
Set me thinking.
Indeed. I think it has to be said, though, that the Church may now have that view, but it certainly would be the case that for a lot of its history, maybe even as much as 1,500 years, it would take a pretty final view of that word. And I think there is a sense in which it would also be important to say is we're in the area here of saying I understand your problem, and I feel pretty apprehensive about that, because it may very well be that a lot of people had a pretty kind of divided view that indeed the goats would go to everlasting hell and the sheep into everlasting light. And so there's a lot of uncomfortable stuff in the New Testament about the gnashing of teeth and all that kind of, which is very, very difficult to come to terms with. Very difficult. I think that also has to be said, yes.
Could I just say that nothing in our experience would lead us to suggest that one could look lightly on that negative fate, because these people did suffer and were miserable indeed. It
Yes.
was a terrible fate.
Oh, indeed.
Condemned to, yes.
That's what Dante's Inferno is all about. Yes, madam.
I'd just like to commend Helen Graves' book, Testimony of Light, which I'm sure many people here will have read. Unfortunately, it's not on the book table because it's sold out.
Helen Graves' Testimony of Light.
Sorry,
Helen
Greaves.
Greaves. Helen Greaves.
Testimony of Light.
Thank you.
And it is very helpful in all respects.
In particular to the second.
I
Yes.
absolutely second that. In fact, I was going to say, here in the fellowship, we must not forget Helen Greaves. The whole answer of the agonies of those that have died in state of stress and strain, wickedness, the whole answer really, or as far as we can see, is love, help, rescue is there, even for the worst. And of course her book was written through Francis Banks, both of whom were wonderful people and very influential in the early days of the Fellowship.
A very good note on which to leave it. And to thank Martin again for such a stimulating and very genuine sharing with us of where he is at the moment. So thank you very much.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.